start the stream. Let me make sure that that's what I want it to be. There it is. Cool. Mic is working. Mic is working. That's working. Great. Okay, so here. So to start out, something that I actually had not realized because I haven't been paying attention to the calendar. We're off next Monday and Tuesday. So for this class, Monday is obviously the important one. But if you have any Tuesday classes here, then obviously you have the 10th off as well. And so for you online people, we won't be having class on Monday either. I'm not going to be recording at home. I'm going to be asleep. And also that would mess up the order of things we're doing. So yeah. So yeah, don't be here Monday or Tuesday because I won't be here. Yeah, that's that. Let me switch this back and try and fix things. Oh, wait, not that. Extend. Keep changes. Did it? No, that's not what. There we go. Okay, let me make sure that this is doing what I want. No, it's not. Perfect. Okay. Before we start the next section, perfect, thank you. Show it again. Okay. Make sure that that's where I want it to be. Good. And the stream is not running live for some reason. Okay, cool. Back over here. Why does it do that? Okay, great. Yes. Either. They're all the same. So, yeah, they're all weighed the same. So if you were to not do good on the test, you definitely want to do both essays because then you'll be able to drop the test. But if you do fine on the test, then you could theoretically drop an essay because they're all weighed the same.
Does it have to be like a B or a B, or it has to be?
It can be whatever you want it to be. Depends on what you want to make for the class. Some people are real anal. They're like, oh, well, I only made a 94, so I'm going to do all of everything. It's like, okay, whatever. Won't work for me. Yeah, so that's up to you. Speaking of tests, I don't have your guys' test graded yet. I've got most of them done. I should be able to finish them, if not this afternoon, because I've got a little bit to do this afternoon, probably by tomorrow. And probably into Friday is when I'll start doing the online grading because that's a lot faster. It grades the multiple choice for me, which is cool. Then I got to go through and do the short answer myself. And then it posts the grades on Blackboard for me because online is slightly merciful. There's other issues with the online stuff that makes up for it. But that said, once I do get your stuff graded, I will go ahead and put that on Blackboard so that you guys can have it as soon as I get them done. Normally I grade them and hand them back and then I get it on Blackboard later, whatever. But since we're not going to be back Monday, or really since this is the end of the week for you guys and I don't have the grades back, I'll put them on Blackboard as soon as I get them done. Which, again, I've got 5 or 6 more. So it'll be done relatively soon. So those will be up on Blackboard as soon as I can get them up there. So far, just based on what I've got, um, most of you have done pretty well. There's quite a few over 100. And about the same amount of A's, just like 90 and above. So yeah, not bad. A few folks maybe won't be as thrilled with your grades, but that's why we do drop the lowest grade. But for the most part, so far looking real good. So, any questions before we start on this next chapter? All set? Okay, so yeah, I'll get the grades in as soon as I can. We have next Monday and Tuesday off. I can't think of anything else. And then, oh, right, and then the paper is due in 2 weeks. So remember that, 2 weeks from today. Again, preferably, I'd like you to physically hand it in, but if you need to email it to me, that's cool too. Obviously, for e-online folks, please ignore that. Email it to me. Don't try to. I mean, if you can physically bring it in and you want to, you can, but you don't have to. Don't. Just don't. Just email it to me. Right. Well, let's get into the next section, which is pretty interesting. I mean, it might just be due to the sort of high schooling I had, and this was something we focused on. So, needless to say, we're going to talk a lot about the Puritans and how they saw things across New England and North America in general. Obviously, they were coming to North America to get away from the wickedness of England and blah, blah, blah. But they also were complaining about the high-handed wickedness of the world in general. One individual who complained was the minister Samuel Sewall, who we will come back to, so he's perhaps important. He was angry about the mercantile elites in Boston. I'll just read this from the book. Citing examples of the depravity in his diary, including the drunkenness and cursing, he claimed that such high-handed wickedness had hardly been heard of before. Outraged as well by popular practices such as donning powdered wigs in place of God-given hair, wearing scarlet and gold jackets rather than simple black cloth, and offering toast rather than prayers. Oh, and earlier, many of whom spent more time at the counting house than in the house of worship. People doing their jobs rather than doing his job, which was to be a minister. Others weren't quite as extreme as him. We have Cotton Mather, son of Increase Mather, who was a little more moderate. He still did complain about some of the issues. He complained about less colonists participating in religious feast days, which a religious feast day back then wasn't just like, you worked in the mornings and then in the afternoon you went to, evening mass and said your prayers and had, roast turkey or something. This was the equivalent of like Jewish Sabbath, where you don't do any work at all day. Like lighting or burning setting the, I'm trying to use words, igniting the fireplace would be considered work. Like you have to keep the fireplace going all night, because if you set it that morning, that's considered work, and you're not supposed to do that. Like, you're not supposed to do work at all day because you're supposed to be, you know, worshiping God and whatnot. And a lot of these colonists, like the mercantile elite, were busy, doing mercantile stuff. So they were skipping a lot of these feast days because if you're busy going to church and not working, you're not making money. But Cotton Mather still did want his son to, quote, become a more refined gentleman. So he still did believe that there was room in his Puritan worldview for this more secular world. That being a refined gentleman wasn't some horrible thing like Sewell believed. He was supported scientific advancements like the smallpox inoculation. So this wasn't some weirdo anti-vax dude like we've got today. They weren't calling every new scientific advancement the mark of the beast. Weird how people in the 1600s and 1700s were like more progressive than today sometimes. With the Glorious Revolution in England, though, they did have some extra authority. We did mention with Cromwell that, Cromwell was Puritan. So when he was in charge, they did have a lot of power, but there was still like this strange sort of mix of religion when Cromwell was in charge, in that like Anglicanism wasn't the de facto state religion anymore, but it wasn't like Puritanism was now in charge. In fact, there were a lot of different sects that came about at the time, including a group known as the Adamites. This is something we talk about in my European history class, but I figured I'd bring it up here. Who believed that Adam and Eve had it right to begin with, so we should all run around naked. And they were just like a nudist group in England. And considering English, like, climate, I don't know, they didn't last very long. Anyway. But there was still a lot going on. King William's War, one of the many wars between France and England. Natives not being so happy with the colonists constantly moving west into more territory. Gave the Puritans the sense that Satan was at work. Because again, if anything ever goes wrong, it's 100% totally Satan's fault. Before we continue on. All right. Here's Samuel Sewell. I know he looks kind of gouty to me. Didn't give him a very good complexion. And speaking of not so great portraits, here's Cotton Mather. Poor boy. Right. Now, obviously, if we're talking about Puritans in New England, you know where we're going. Witchcraft. This was not something new in the slightest. had been a thing in Europe for centuries. It was a convenient scapegoat anytime something happened that people didn't understand, which, again, we're talking about like from the late Middle Ages on. There was lots of stuff people didn't understand. Um, Unexpected storms, suspicious fires, sudden death of livestock, that sort of thing. Anything that happened that you didn't understand and you didn't like, totally the witch's fault. So, since God worked through nature, it was believed that Satan too could do things and affect the world. So, if they were to form children, certain astrological signs, eclipses, that was definitely, Satan working in the world, which, considering we had a total eclipse not that long ago, it is kind of spooky. And I can't imagine, not knowing it's coming and being out working in the field and suddenly the sun disappears for a couple of minutes. I mean, even knowing it was coming and, being sitting there waiting for it was still freaking surreal. So, once these weird things started happening and they needed to find somebody to blame, anybody seen as outside the norm were typically those suspected, which is to say, usually women, especially if they were seen as quarrelsome, eccentric, poor, just oftentimes like hermits or widows that were often living outside of town, or old beggars that just sort of hung around. Anybody that really couldn't defend themselves for the most part. So these sort of things happen most often during times of change, and as the 1600s rolled on, there was a lot of change. Colonists pushing west, pissing off more natives, and also getting up towards the Appalachians and encountering new harsh environments that they were not prepared for, which of course didn't mean that they were encountering harsh environments they weren't prepared for. It meant that it was 100% totally Satan that was out to get them. So between 1647 and 1692, we are stopping on that year for a very specific reason. 160 individuals were accused of being witches, Massachusetts and Connecticut, though only 15 were put to death, which, is 15 too many for something people are making up. But we'll get to some numbers here in a minute. So, crops being ruined, neighbors becoming sick, cattle dying, things that, again, seemed like they were targeted, and they needed somebody to blame. However, again, this were often poor, childless, disgruntled women, but sometimes these would be widows who had inherited property, and were seen as suspicious if they fought to keep that land from male relatives or neighbors who try to take it from them. Because, how dare they want to keep land that they had inherited from their dead husband. So a lot of this was motivated by money. A lot of this was, how dare these women have land and not be willing to give it up. They're definitely totally witches. And even if they aren't put to death, being accused of being a witch was usually enough to get them blacklisted or kicked out of town or in some way dispossessed of their belongings. So it didn't even have to be like, oh, we're going to get this lady killed so we can take her stuff. It was just enough to ruin her reputation and have all her stuff taken. Anyway, in the spirit of the spooky season, I have a terrifying image here of Satan, or of the witches consorting with Satan. Look how happy he is. He's having a great time. And you got the witches with their massive chins. And whatever the hell these are up in the air. This is easily one of my favorite images. There's another one, but apparently I have it from my European class, and I forgot to transfer it over here, where it's like a witch feeding these things in like a chest of drawers, and two of them look like giant toads. I mean, they're like this big. And the third one looks like, I don't know if it was supposed to be a cat, a rat, or like a possum, but it was some kind of scraggly ass hairy thing next to the toads. And she looks like one of these ladies, and she's like got a cauldron in one hand and a spoon in the other, and she's like feeding them like her children. I don't know, it's weird. And then we got something going on here. The cat's not having a good time. The dog just wants to be involved. Knock something off the table. There's a child here looming. I'd be scared of the child too. Freaking kids, man. And they got these folks in the stocks. Again, I don't know why, like, this lady looks like she's having a good time. She's smiling. This guy's getting carried off. There's a kid, like, hanging bodily out the window to watch. Everybody else is having a good time. I don't know, some of these illustrations are somewhat confusing. He's clearly not enjoying himself, which makes sense. Look, everybody else seems to be having a good time. All right, on to what everybody's been waiting for, Salem. So Salem was, of course, the most famous witch hunt here in North America. And it was facing all sorts of changes, not just the Glorious Revolution, the various native attacks, newer families moving in and butting heads with the older families that have been there. They also had a new minister. In fact, they had gone without a minister for several years, which for a Puritan colony in Massachusetts was kind of unheard of, because again, it's not like, I mean, I'm from Florence. You can't drive down the road without passing like 7 churches. Here you had one church because it was the town's church, and the minister was basically an elected official, as important as like, the town council or any elected official. So the fact that they went without one for any amount of time was just an example of how bad things were. And when the dude showed up, I'm trying to remember, I think he came from Boston, and Salem was kind of a backwoods town, and he treated the folks in Salem pretty poorly. He spoke down to them. He wasn't this warm, comforting individual that they had been used to. So they already kind of hated him. They were butting heads right away. So when his daughter and niece were discovered to be learning voodoo lore and exotic dances from his West Indian slave, well, uh, they weren't exactly going to look the other way. Now, there's a little bit more detail to this in the notes that I'd used before from one of my professors, so I'm going to insert a little bit of that. Part of the lore and like fortune telling that they had learned from Tituba was like this. They had this crystal ball or some kind of like decanter. It was, I think it might have or been like a bowl. Um, Basically, you'd crack an egg and put the yolk in, and due to the distortion of the way the bowl was, um, it would supposedly make the yolk form a certain shape, and that would tell you something about your future. And usually, because I mean, the girls were young, they were like maybe young teenagers, maybe a little bit younger than that. They were just old enough to be like wondering about boys, and like, oh, what's my future husband going to be like? So that was what they were asking. And what scared them was because they were raised Puritan, everything in the world is scary and the devil's going to get you. What they saw in their mind when the egg was cracked and dropped in the bowl was a skull. And instead of what my future husband's going to be, it's just your future is death, and they freaked out. And they tried to keep it under wraps for a few days, but it was very clear that they were basically having constant panic attacks, and eventually they broke, and it all came out. So they, of course, blamed Tituba for it, but because of, well, again, how they had been raised, they began blaming other members of the community. Elderly female pauper, homeless widow, the usual witch suspects. But then respectable church women, a minister, a wealthy merchant, and even a 4-year-old child. And we'll get into where some of these accusations came from in just a little bit. Soon more than 100 people were accused, 80% of whom were women. This blew out of control very quickly, and William Phips, who was the new governor of the Massachusetts colony, set up a special court in 1692 to handle the case, got a bunch of Puritan ministers to sit on the court, including Samuel Sewall. Remember him from just a couple of slides ago? Well, he's going to complain about how everybody's dressed, but he's going to be there. This is where a lot of the evidence came from. This idea of spectral evidence, where the girls had dreams and visions and claimed that they saw such and such consorting with the devil or out in the woods and yada, yada, yada. Like, none of this was, I was there and physically saw them, but I saw them in my visions. And in the end, 20 people were executed, mostly by hanging. I think one by crushing, one by drowning. And then the accusations continued on, and including major families in Salem and Boston, and I think even Phipps's wife. And he's like, "Yeah, okay, we're done here. We're stopping this." And a fair few actually just died in prison, because I mean that happens a lot back then. Like back during the French Revolution, 5,000 were sent to death by a guillotine, but another like 2,000 died just waiting in prison. So, just being in prison, there's a good chance you're going to die just due to the conditions. So here's a fun image. I don't know what's supposed to be happening. Dude back here is going to fight the lightning with a sword. Oh, right. I specifically mentioned that the executions were largely done by a hanging, and there was at least the one case of crushing, which is a bad way to go. However, in Europe, they had a different favorite way of dealing with witches, and that was burning them at the stake. And apparently that baby got it too. One other thing. I forgot to mention this in my Tuesday, Thursday class. I have to tell them tomorrow. This was something else that was brought up in a completely different class that I taught. It was just like this weird, I don't even remember what it was called. It was some kind of offshoot humanities course. One of the theories as to what caused all this, besides the religious paranoia of being a Puritan, is that the location where the people were living, in particular, Samuel Parris and his family, it was rather swampy, and where they were growing their wheat, or rye, actually, it wasn't wheat. Middle. Long story short, it was very likely infected by this fungus called ergot, ERGOT. And if you make bread with that and eat it, it will poison you. And that will cause neurological damage, which includes tremors, muscle spasms, and hallucinations. Which sounds kind of familiar, especially this. Now, obviously, we can't really go back and check to be 100% sure, but that is one of the leading theories as to like what really kicked this off, as far as what the girls claim to be seeing and writhing on the ground and stuff. So yeah, just FYI, a little bit of side information for you guys. All right, let's go a little bit further. And this definitely, this was the next section, but it very much is part of the Salem witch trials. Part of why they happened. So early on, most of the settlers coming into North America were men. So white women had some level of power since there weren't very many of them. So white women who came in as indentured servants, who managed to make it through, could marry older men of wealth, and if the men died first, which often happened, they could usually get the rights of the property and have some level of wealth. Because, you just marry an old man that's about to cack it and wait on him to die. And by old man, I mean like, what was the life expectancy back then, 40? So, as time went on, though, gender ratios started to even out, and with slavery and indentured servitude, spreading out the labor more evenly, women were no longer as in control as they had been, or at least what little bit of control they had. I shouldn't say they were in control really at all. But they lost a lot of that in that they had. This also pushed them into more domestic labor roles rather than actually being out there helping on the farm. Not that that ever truly ended, which we will circle back to. However, this was the legal status of women, supposedly. This was supposed to be the, on paper, how things were supposed to be. Femme covert, or covert, I don't know. It's Old English, which is kind of French, so I'm not sure how it is pronounced. Old English common law, wife's legal status is covered over, or to be directly translated, hidden behind her husband's, which is to further say a wife's legal status was the same as that of a child. She couldn't do anything without her husband say so. She couldn't go out and buy something without the permission of her husband. She couldn't go out and, open a bank account. Completely under the control of her husband. So this was part of the patriarchal family, this bulwark against disorder as the country was becoming more diverse, because they were getting more groups from different countries in, and that was seen as big and scary. So we have to have a family run by the father and keep things strict and orderly. But this was really only directly felt in the wealthy families. Families want to control the behavior of their sons and daughters, build commercial and political alliances, because again, as we've seen, the wealthy elite became the new nobility here in North America. So, you'd have these two merchant families that want to have a merger essentially, and they would manage that through literally like a political marriage. And since the fathers would be in charge, as per this, their kids wouldn't really have a choice. Now, some women did manage to escape the strict fathers and husbands. Most were stuck. And even after the death of the husband, there were still, male family members, brothers-in-laws, brothers, etc., that maintained this structure. This does lead to another of my favorite images. It's not quite as amusing as Satan, but it does have the really long pipe where he's just setting it on the table, but he's still smoking it. It's just the lazy pipe. Although it's if you're going to replace the tobacco in it, you have to set it down, and the end's way over here. Anyway, dog's asleep. Mother and daughter mending the curtains, looks like, and the cat's over here about to have a fight. So there's a lot going on. I approve of this picture. Although the cats are kind of stocky. Look at that cat's leg, so little. Little munchkin cats. All right. Let's see how much of this section we can get done. And then we'll be good to stop because I don't want to get into the economics. All right. So, despite all of what we just talked about, most colonists weren't merchant elites in the seaport cities. They were out on the frontier, or at least out on small farms, just trying to survive. And husbands and wives typically had to work together. So, the 1712 book by Benjamin Wadsworth, The Well-Ordered Family, urged couples to delight in each other's company, be helpful to each other, and bear one another's burdens. You know, try and get along. You're stuck together. And even with artisans who were usually at least upper middle class, wives would learn the husband's crafts because, well, they were very much involved. They were helping the apprentices as well as the children because, as I had said, a lot of times the apprentices were essentially adopted into the family and treated as part of the family, so they might as well know how to do some of the work if they're helping the apprentices. So farms where most of this was going on, there was some distinction between what men and women did. Wives and daughters did a lot of the domestic work, but they were still out doing farm work as well. Garden work, milk house, chicken coop, dairy and wash house. Again, milking cows and especially the washing, that is not easy work. Besides the fact that they were, using the washboard and just having to beat the hell out of the clothes to wash them, they weren't made of cotton. They were linen. And if you ever had something linen get wet, it gets very heavy. Like when you think of linens today, it's like that's not. Linens is just like a slang term for, your towels and washcloths. Like linens, it's plant material. It gets very heavy. Husbands and sons are usually out working the fields, keeping the livestock, managing orchards, the part that's the greater land area of the farm. And even with this, they were usually still bringing in people to help, servants, slaves, hired farm hands. As I mentioned many times, especially when it was harvest season, you'd bring in everybody you could. Grandma, grandpa, little Timmy, everybody came out to help. Some dude walking down the street, hey, you want to make a couple of bucks, come help us harvest. Everybody worked harvest time. And often they would trade within the local communities. Is this next one? Yeah. They work together as specialized, either labor or equipment, to make goods and services for each other that the other didn't have. So if one farm had a grist mill, which is it's got the big stone slabs that turn the wheat into flour so you can make bread, that's an expensive piece of equipment. And people would come and use your grist mill. And as payment, they would usually bring whatever they made on their farm. Eggs, milk, potatoes, something that maybe they had that you didn't have and you wouldn't have to grow or raise or whatever. And it was a good trade. Helped everybody. Because you can't really be self-sufficient on a farm. Even that's a big part of the American myth of, like, especially the frontier of, oh, you're going west on your own and make it by yourself. that was never the case. You had to work at least with other groups of people to be able to make it. You didn't necessarily have to have like a town to survive, but you needed other groups of people because then you get cases like this where you get the husband and it looks like older brother dies and the horse is going to be next, and you just got the dog and the little brother and the mom who looks like she's also close to the grave, and there's not much left. Although, and even here it looks like there's stuff on fire in the background. There's not a lot good here. Speaking of bad stuff, speaking of things that'll get you killed, oh man, my neck is just not having it today. Having babies, that will kill you. So since working on a farm required both men and women, marriage wasn't just, a social and religious institution, it was an economic partnership. So with people not, mortality is more about infant mortality. So with children not dying like immediately, by 1700, a woman who lived to 45 could have about 8 kids. New England, you were more likely to live to a ripe old age of 45. While in the Chesapeake region, you were less likely to make it very long due to, the mosquitoes. And obviously, among the enslaved African Americans, fertility rates were very low due to poor treatment. And it wasn't until the 1740s that their reproduction rate actually was higher than the number of slaves being imported. And of course, the level of reproduction depended on how hard they were being worked, whether that was out on the farm or domestic work, because, as hard as some of the domestic work can be, it's usually not going to kill you as fast as the farm work. And also the immigrants from Europe, especially the Irish and Scots, tended to have a lot of kids, especially the Irish, because they were Catholic. But still, regardless of who and where they were, mothers had to have the kids, raise the kids, and also continue doing their work. Nothing ever stops. Some families, very few families, could afford nannies or wet nurses, but most had to just do the whole thing on their own. Like that image I showed you a while back of like everybody out working the field and the kids like in a hammock in the tree. Mothers are, of course, at high risk of dying. 1 in 30 births ended in the death of the mother. And when the mother died, the father would quickly remarry because, taking care of children was considered woman's work. There is a gravestone in the book. Here lies the body of Lois Sprague, wife to Samuel Sprague, aged 24 years, died April 6, 1696. Also here lies her child. So she died in childbirth, and her infant died as well. And it also mentions Many prayed intensely before and during labor, hoping to survive the ordeal. One minister urged pregnant women to prepare their souls, claiming, "For ought you to know, your death has entered into you." Thanks, ministers. It's very, very comforting. Anyway, here's some terrifying soulless eye babies. Here's an actual photograph of enslaved folk. All right, I think we might be able to finish this section. So let's just do a little bit more and we can call it a day. So all of that is what's on paper as how things were meant to be, but that's not always how they match reality. We have lots of newspaper reports. Reports of domestic violence, ads for runaway spouses, petitions for divorce, legal suits charging rape, seduction, or breach of contract, because again, marriage was considered a contract. So lots of this strict patriarchy not exactly playing out as suggested on paper. Of course, women reporting men of mistreating them didn't necessarily get a court date. Many times they were just ignored, disregarded as gossip. However, due to the way most regions in North America were small, close-knit societies, if they could effectively wield this gossip to destroy the trust around the abusive husband in question, well, the way I described it to my class yesterday, like, you know, today you can go up to Wendy's or whatever and get you a burger. But back then, if you went to the shop to get you something to eat, you knew the person because, well, your town was like 300 people. You knew everybody, and everybody knew you. And if word started spreading that you were an abusive asshole and most of the people in the town liked your wife, and people started noticing you were kind of a jerk and started to believe you were an abusive asshole, then maybe the people at the shop stopped selling to you. Maybe the people in the bar stopped selling to you. And suddenly the town's closed to you. You're not being legally punished for what you did, but the town has essentially shut you out. So it's a thing that existed, and it certainly isn't as good as actual legal recourse, but it was a thing that happened. Now, divorce, of course, not the easiest thing. Obviously, most of the power went to the husband. Even then, though, if, let's say best case scenario, let's best possible thing. Let's say the husband and wife both agree, this isn't working out. We need to go our separate ways. Let's be completely amicable about it. There's not any kind of abuse. Nobody's hurting anybody. Nobody's cheating on anybody. They're gonna go their separate ways. Everything's cool, which in the 1700s I don't think that would happen very often. But let's just pretend. Let's go. Let's go on a pretend journey. That was very hard because the only way to get a divorce was to go to the city council. And because we're still mostly in New England here, the city council was typically run by the church leaders. So you're going up to a bunch of Puritans and saying, hey, we want a divorce. And how do you think the Puritan leaders tended to view divorce? Not so good. Yeah, so it was very difficult to get a divorce back then. And again, most of the time it was just like, okay, well, we're just going to throw the wife to the curb and give everything to the husband. So again, even if it was like the most amicable possible thing where the husband's like on equal footing with the wife and everything's cool, there was still a great chance that they weren't going to get anything from the Puritan leaders. As far as any amount of recourse, women who had some amount of wealth did have some limited power. Women who were poor and enslaved were obviously without. The only real chance they had was to actually run away, just get out of Dodge, which of course was very unsafe, but I mean, either stay in a place where you're being horribly abused or get out on the road and hope for the best. So yeah, not a great place. So, rather than seek counsel from fathers or ministers, a lot of women began turning to friends and sisters for help because the fathers and ministers tended to be more interested in maintaining the systems of control that help them, as opposed to actually helping the victim because, well, this is how it should be. So the women started looking to each other for help, as opposed to going to the people who benefited from the systems in place. And also, we do have about 10 minutes left, and I'm not going to continue on any further, but I do want to show this image before we all start packing up and making a bunch of noise. The life and age of woman, stages of a woman's life from infancy to the brink of the grave. I do like the comparison here between like the girl and the kitten, and then as she gets older, it's like this. I can't tell if it's supposed to be a deer or like a gazelle. It looks like a gazelle. Like she's, agile and lean, and then as she gets older, she becomes like more beautiful and, like a harpsichord. And then as she gets older, she's this old, decrepit cat and is getting near death. And then here you have the mother teaching her child to, renew the cycle again. But we're going to look at another version of this a little bit later as we get to the Prohibition. What's the phrase? Today, especially with the internet culture, we have like meme formats where you have like something like this, and then you just replace what's going on here with pictures of other stuff. This has been around forever. So we're going to see this same format, but with something else a little bit later. I just find that really interesting for something in the 1700s. But yeah, we'll talk about economy stuff next Wednesday, I guess. So I will see y'all next week. I will have the grades up. Probably not this afternoon because I got stuff to do, but by this weekend at the latest. So y'all take care.